Hello and welcome back to Chronicled, the history of Newcastle United. I'm Matt Ketchell, fan, engagement and football editor at Chronicle Live, and we're going to cover possibly the lowest ebb of Newcastle's 140-year history today, the period between Kevin Keegan leaving as a player and returning as a manager, 1984 to 1992. Joining me to do this is, of course, the club's official historian, Paul Joannou, and perhaps the ultimate 80s and 90s Newcastle United expert, Mark Corby, a lifelong Toon fan, fanzine contributor, NUFC Supporters Trust member, and the admin of one of my favourite Facebook pages, which shares rare Newcastle United pictures and video clips from the period of 1980 through to 1994. Mark, welcome to the show. I was wondering if you could just start by giving us a little bit of a background on yourself as a fan of Newcastle United and obviously your specific interest in the 80s and 90s era of the club.
Yeah, appreciate the invite, gents. Pleasure to be here. Yeah, I mean, my first game wasn't until early 1988, but I was hooked on Newcastle probably around about 85, 86 period. Peter Beardsley, and then when he went to the World Cup and part of Gary Lineker, that was it. That was such an influence on me being sort of obsessed with football. And I suppose from that moment, it was just a case of counting down the days till I could find someone to take me to the game who shared the interests. Luckily, I got to see Paul Gascoigne and the likes of Paul Goddard, etc., who I'm sure we'll talk about in greater detail. And I suppose my contribution to sort of fanzines and the nostalgia page you mentioned, it was just out of sheer boredom. When we got relegated in 2009, it was just what's going to happen to the football club now under Mike Ashley, and set up the Facebook page, and lo and behold, met some excellent contributors from all around the world, really, who just send me their personal pictures of games that they've attended, behind the scenes footage, and it's just went from strength to strength. It's still a joy to do it, and it's just nice that I've mentioned the board of Mike Ashley and bring them right up to date. Now we've got a new era ahead of us, which hopefully we can get a little bit more excited about.
Yeah, definitely. It's made for a fantastic last chapter of this podcast series, put it that way. But we're strictly 1984 to 1992 today, and we've got a couple of those pictures that you mentioned to discuss later on in the show. But we're going to try and cover 8 seasons in this episode, and they were eventful to say the least. The ugly, the bad, and eventually the good. Paul, can you set the scene at the club then with Kevin Keegan helicoptering off into the night and the team preparing for a Division 1 campaign without King Kev in 1984?
Yeah, well, in the summer of 1984, as United began another period back in the top flight, it all started with a bang, really. Unfortunately, it was the departure of Arthur Cox, who moved on to Derby County after a dispute over money and funding for players. And in came a Geordie hero to take charge, World Cup winner Jack Charlton, who everybody knew and loved in the North East. Without Kevin Keegan, could United stay at the top flight was the big question. They still did have both Chris Waddle and Peter Beardsley, and they both flourished at a higher level. But immediately, Big Jack's style of football saw United change the way they played with Keegan. It was quite a contrast. We had a high ball game to suit 2 tall new strikers, which were added to the ranks, Tony Cunningham and George Riley. Now, not everyone liked that, fans and players alike. Importantly, Waddle and Beardsley weren't too keen on that style of football. But Big Jack made sure United stayed in Division 1, finishing in 14th spot.
Right, and something unique also happened at the club, which I'm not sure had ever happened before. Maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, but it definitely hasn't happened since. Newcastle won the FA Youth Cup.
Well, they had won it before, back in 1962, when a group of stars developed, the likes of Moncur, Craig and Suddick and the like, and it happened again at that time. There was a Youth Cup victory for the juniors, and a batch of kids started to break through, just like 1962, including a certain Paul Gascoigne. But United lost one of their stars to begin with. Chris Waddle moved to Spurs at the end of the season for a hefty fee.
Yeah, good opportunity, I think, for our first player focus of the episode, Paul. Chris Waddle, if you wouldn't mind. Tell us about Waddler.
Yeah, well, Waddler wasn't one of those FA Youth Cup lads. He came to Newcastle from the old-fashioned Northern League, from Townlow Town, of all clubs, as a raw winger. That happened in July 1980, and he cost all of £1,000 to start with. He never looked like an athlete. Anybody who saw him in the reserves to start with, he looked like a lumbering forward, tall, with not a great athletic build. But Arthur Cox and Kevin Keegan played a huge part in the Gateshead lad developing into a top player. And by 1984-85, he was one of the best new prospects in the country. He could go past players with a telling cross and score goals on a regular basis. And England came calling, as did Tottenham, and he moved down to White Hart Lane for 590,000, which was a big fee. And that was in July 1985. Of course, Waddle moved on again to Marseille in 1989, and that's when the French club were one of the best club sides in Europe. And Waddle really reached his peak with Marseille because he was absolutely fabulous. And I don't know if anybody wants to see a clip or some good clips of Waddle in Marseille. There's a video that you can find, or DVD probably now, Le Dribble Fou, and some of the stuff he did with Marseille was just amazing. He earned 62 caps for England and reached 2 World Cups, and was quite a player. The first of 3 that Newcastle lost that really we should have kept.
Yeah, definitely. I'll try and put a link to that video Paul's described in the show notes. I literally saw a clip today on Twitter, the one where he flicks it over the goalkeeper and backheels it into the empty net for Marseille. Mark, where do you stand on Chris Waddle? I unfortunately never got to see him play in a black and white shirt, but he was a Geordie, and he did seem like a real Newcastle fan type of player, quite a lot of flair, but obviously did his best stuff away from St James's Park.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like yourself, Mark, I never had the fortune to see Waddle in black and white, but he was one of those players, as I mentioned before, with the World Cup '86. He was a standout player. You had Lineker, you had Brian Robson, players like that. You couldn't help but admire these players, and you educate yourself over the years and work out how they did it at your club. And it's just unfortunate he was a player that I never got to see. A bit like Supermac, a bit like Kevin Keegan in his playing days. And it's just sad that I never got to see them. But as Paul rightly said there, he went on to be an absolutely fantastic player at every club he served. Even when you go back up to when we got in the Premier League, when he come back with Sheffield Wednesday and John Beresford had the misfortune of marking him that night. We might have won 4-2, but Chris Waddle was unbelievable. And it's just quite sad that we never got that opportunity to re-sign him, because I know Keegan definitely was looking at him when we were on the verge of getting promoted. But yeah, I think with Chris Waddle, the jury's always out on whether you believe he was a Newcastle or a Sunderland supporter mind. And I do think it's quite sad that some people referred him as a Judas, because the club had no ambition, and it continued with other players, which we'll touch on, but they had no ambition. And as Paul touched on before, I shuddered when he mentioned George O'Reilly and Tony Cunningham, because Charlton's setup was to suit them, and Waddle and Beardsley unfortunately suffered a little bit because of that. They were a very, very exciting partnership, and it's just a shame that that Charlton ended up playing him on the wings fundamentally. But a fantastic player. Shame I never seen him in black and white, and hey, he went on to have a fantastic career, didn't he?
Yeah, great, interesting shout about him potentially signing for Keegan when Keegan came back as a manager. He did seem tailor-made for the entertainers like Beardsley, but obviously never happened.
Yeah.
On to 1985-86 then, Paul. The fans weren't happy, and unfortunately this disquiet seemed to transmit onto the pitch and into the dugout, didn't it?
It did. During the pre-season of 85-86, fans became very restless, having sold Waddle. Funds were limited, and Jack Charlton was giving stick at the pre-season friendly against Sheffield United for his style of play and uninspiring signings. And Big Jack had no time for that at all, and didn't like the criticism, and simply walked out the club, not to come back, apart from in later years to watch his beloved Newcastle United, as he was always a fan from childhood. United had to find a new manager again, and on the eve of the new season, in stepped coach and former Fairs Cup winning goalkeeper Willie McFall. The popular McFall, he was there's not many goalkeeper managers in the game, but he did pretty well to start with. He reverted back to a more pleasing style of football, and United finished in mid-table. Yet they lost Peter Beardsley this time at the end of the season. He had appeared for England with Waddle, but moved to Liverpool for a record fee at the end of that season. And that was number 2 of 3 to depart over the Tyne Bridge. And as we mentioned before there, as Mark mentioned, probably nobody could blame those 3 lads for leaving Newcastle at that time, because the club were in a pretty dire state, and all 3 were destined for much bigger things, which was proved the case when they moved on.
Yeah, interesting on Jack Charlton. Imagine if managers today moved on as soon as the fans gave them stick. It would be a different landscape entirely. Mark, though, Jack Charlton, he went on obviously to achieve great success as manager of Ireland. Would you have liked to have seen him stay and make more of a fist of things, especially given his playing career, the family connections that he had to the club and the region?
I think in hindsight, it's probably a blessing that he did go, because as Paul rightly says, that the football wasn't attractive. I think there was sort of talk that perhaps Jack Charlton treated the club's money like his own. He just didn't want to spend it. But Paul know more than me whether there was funds readily made available. There's not many people you can say are legends for 2 countries. Republic and in England. He's well thought of, so fair play to him. And as Paul said, he never took any criticism. And you've got to give him the credit, because he did say, if you don't want us, tell us and I'll go. And he did. That was pretty much Jack Charlton to a T. You've got to admire how his career turned out. And again, though, if you look at the Republic of Ireland team that he built over the following 10 years or so, it was pretty much like what we witnessed at Newcastle, the target man. But he could get the best out of players. But yeah, sadly missed. I wouldn't say I would have been too disappointed if I'd have stayed around. But then again, I wasn't around to watch it. I think just with educating myself over the years at that time, I just don't think his football style was suited to what Newcastle supporters wanted, especially as Paul said after the style that Arthur Cox set up for us for promotion.
So Geordies are leaving the club as quick as they're joining the first team, weren't they, Paul? But at least some graduates from this talented youth team were beginning to get game time.
Yeah, well, saw Gascoigne make an impact, and he became a regular in the side. But he was to be the 3rd Geordie star to head out of Gallagher's, unfortunately, in the not too distant future. But also to find a place times were junior graduates, Paul Stevenson, a raiding winger, and centre forward Joe Allen, who maybe didn't get enough chances in the black and white shirt and went on to have a good career elsewhere.
And another player whose name is synonymous with this particular era, Peter Beardsley. He's someone who's absolutely worthy of a player-focused, Paul. One of the best. So if you would talk us through Peter Beardsley's time at Newcastle, please.
Well, yeah, there's an awful lot to say about Peter Beardsley. 326 appearances, 119 goals in 2 spells at Newcastle. And without doubt, one of the top 10 players of all time in Newcastle colours. He was at St James's Park 1983 to 87, and then returned, of course, in 1993 to 97, as both as players, and then he came back as a coach later. Long Benton, born and bred, product of Wallsend Boys Club. It took a while for Peter to hit the big time. He was at Carlisle United, and everybody loved him at Carlisle in the lower divisions. Then he went to Vancouver Whitecaps, and he had a trial even at Manchester United. Played 1 game, but they didn't sign him. And then he arrived at St James's Park September 1983 for 120,000, and he partnered Kevin Keegan and quickly became a new star in English football. Peter had everything as a footballer. He had worth ethics, pace, vision, importantly ball talent at creating and scoring goals. And those goals, over the years that we saw him, so many were so spectacular efforts and eye-catching moments. But Liverpool came calling in July 1987, 1.5 million record sale. Yet Kevin Keegan always admired him, and when he was boss, he brought him back in July 1993 to become a key factor in United's Premier League resurgence. And at that time, he was even better, to be honest. He was just such one of the best players in the country in that second spell during the entertainers era. 59 England caps, 2 World Cups like Waddle, just a fabulous footballer. Can't say much more than that.
Mark, I'm not sure if you caught Peter's first spell at Newcastle. You might have caught the end, but you would have definitely caught the 1990s Peter Beasley at Newcastle. Where does he rank in terms of players you've seen play for the club?
Yeah, without a doubt, he's my favourite of all time. You know, without a shadow of a doubt. You know, you think of the amount of players that he influenced, both at Newcastle, but also for England, for Liverpool. And as Paul said there, when he left Newcastle, he left a poor, average team, and went and played with the country's best in John Barnes, Aldridge, Ian Rush come back from Juventus. And, you know, it's interesting that he went to the arch rivals Everton, didn't he? And he rejoined another sort of poor team on the slide. But when Kevin Keegan, you know, signed him, that was the lift. It was just the lift that we needed. And I think we knew in 1993 that we were going to be okay in the Premier League. We never expected Beasley to be as good as he was, I don't think. He was criminally overlooked by Graham Taylor at England, and lo and behold, we didn't qualify for the 1994 World Cup in the US. But you know, his form for Newcastle, Terry Reynolds recalled him, won his 50th cap, I think, when at Newcastle, and obviously grabbed a few more. And he was on the verge of the Euro 96 World Cup. That's how great he still was playing in his mid-30s. I didn't catch him in his first spell, but I always recall when we were live on television, which was a rarity back then. We played West Ham. We beat them 4-0. We were bottom of the league, and West Ham were challenging at the top. And it was the sort of the build-up was all about who was going to partner Gary Lineker, Peter Beardsley or Tony Cottee at West Ham. And Peter Beardsley just stole the show. He was absolutely phenomenal. And it's one of them games which sometimes I'll just watch again because the atmosphere is electric. That was one of the reasons why I knew I had to go to the game, because the atmosphere came across brilliant on the telly. We battered West Ham 4-0. Peter Beasley was a standout player, and we had the foundations of a good squad, you know, going into the last couple of years of the 80s. But Beasley, just absolutely phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. And I know Ian Wright said he was the best striker he ever played with. Gary Lineker did. Andy Cole must say that he's up there with the best. So just phenomenal, and the best ever for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I know that West Ham game. I think the full thing's on YouTube, so it's another one we'll try and link to in the show notes. Paul, into 1986, how did new manager Willie McFall handle the revolving door culture at St James's Park?
Well, before Beardsley left the club, 1986-87 was, you know, a reasonable season in the end, although United had a poor start. They were sucked into a relegation fight, but a few choice signings made sure of survival, and certainly Paul Goddard, when he came from West Ham, he arrived and hit 13 goals, including 8 in only 9 games. He was a quality striker, absolutely made the difference up front, and Newcastle survived. A young Scot, Darren Jackson, also impressed in the side as well. But by then, it was the beginnings of a power struggle for control of Newcastle United. In the summer of 87, the club had to appease supporters without doubt, or at least try to. For the new season, there was something of a mini spending spree, with Glyn Hodges and John Robertson arriving for big fees. Neither, though, were a success. But the first Brazilian to hit the top level in England came along, a chap called Mirandina, and he caught the imagination of everyone, really. And at first, the £575,000 record buy looked a good purchase. He scored 13 goals in his first season, and United at times looked good when Mirandina and Gascoigne combined up front. And they were supported by another youngster who came from Ireland this time, Michael O'Neill, and he netted 13 goals as well. United ended in a respectable and pleasing 8th place. But by the end of that season, Paul Gascoigne joined Chris Waddle at Tottenham, and that was, you know, a real blow. Newcastle fans were just dumbfounded that we'd lost first Waddle and then Beardsley and now Gascoigne, who had just developed into a huge star in the making. That fueled anger pointed at the board, and without doubt, revolution was in the air.
Mark, this is a really mixed period for the club. They just seem to be making some good decisions, like, Mirandinha coming in, but also some catastrophically bad ones too, I have to say.
Absolutely. I mean, Paul mentioned Gaza leaving, but also Paul Goddard. I mean, the impact, he was a great hold-up player. And obviously we lost Neil MacDonald as well, who was, floating around the England squad. But all three, in a way, were probably moved out because of the club's lack of direction, lack of ambition. And, we may have had a good new stand getting built, the new West Stand going up, which became the Millburn. But ultimately, as Kevin Keegan once said, stands don't win your football games, good footballers do. And we kept selling our best players. But flip side of that, we did end up spending a hell of a lot of that money in the summer of 1988. And we did have one of the most expensive squads. So I think the disappointment of losing those three quality players was sort of subsided a little bit, because we ended up buying some what we thought were great prospects. Some young players come and signing, and we spent money for once. Broke the record a few times, as Paul said. And even though the disappointment of losing my best players, I genuinely felt that we were still going to build and progress.
Yeah, we'll talk about that spending spree in a second. But it's just mad that some huge names played for the club during this period. Big local English Geordies who went on to have international success, and not many come bigger in football. And a lad from Dunstan, Paul Gascoigne. Paul, we need to hear the detail on Gaza's time at Newcastle. The third player focus we've done this during this episode, but all three are worthy of them, not least Gaza.
Yeah, well, he joined United as a kid in June 1981, and rapidly developed to make his debut in 1985. Even as a teenager, anybody who saw him play for the junior side and then the reserves could see that he had something special. He just stood out above everybody else, and that always tends to happen in football at that level. If you got the real quality, you stand out, and Gascoigne did. He had a special talent. He had skills to match the best. Great vision with the ball. Could pass a ball short, long. He could shoot, and he could dribble through defenders, and he was strong on the ball. And he had a brand of entertainment, and really he was a bit like he was the Len Shackleton of years before. He was an entertainer, and he loved to play to the crowd as well. He became the country's biggest personality in that era, yet left, as we know, to Tottenham, and later starred in Italy with Lazio, and over the border with Rangers. 57 England caps to match the likes of Waddle and Beardsley, famously to star in the World Cup of 1990. He had a string of clubs at the end of his career, including Everton and Middlesbrough, and still is thought of as quite a special footballer even today.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul Gaza wasn't someone that I got to see play for Newcastle. I did see him play for Everton and a couple of other clubs. I don't know if you saw him, Mark, and I think the move away from Newcastle was right for Gaza, but maybe he should have gone to Man United rather than Tottenham. That's a debate. I don't know what your thoughts are on Gaza, Mark, but I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, I did fortunately see Gascoigne. He was, especially in the turn of the year in 1988. I remember he was winning, I think it was the Barclays Young Eagle Award. He the best young player in the country, and he was winning it every other month. He was phenomenal. And he went on a bit of a scoring spell as well. I know we mentioned Michael O'Neill and Mirandinha there. Mirandinha scored a lot in the first half of the season, and Michael O'Neill took over in the second half. But Gascoigne as well, he scored some very important goals. Some really good. He was a good free kick taker. He could score screamers. As Paul said, influential. He could take players on. Much of the frustration of his teammates at times, mine. I do remember him having a bit of an argument with Paul Goddard on the pitch one game I attended. But yeah, he was phenomenal. And it's quite sad that his first game for Spurs was the following season, and it was his debut at St James's Park. And the amount of abuse him and Chris Waddle got that day, the footage is out there, and it's quite sad to think that the supporters didn't look at the bigger picture, and the fact that they walked away because of lack of ambition. But I suppose I think moving to Spurs did upset a lot of supporters simply because Spurs were probably on Paul Russell around about that time. Average mid-table team going through different periods. I think a lot of people would have probably understood if you went to Man United or Liverpool, but because you went to Spurs, I think there was a lot more upset. But as Paul said, he had a fantastic career, and Christ, best player in the world in 1990. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, I'd agree. And as we approach the 90s, Paul, things start to get a little bit ugly in the boardroom at St James's Park. Can you explain what the situation was there?
Well, there was shareholder infighting at that time, 1988-89. That escalated in the background, and United had again to try and appease fans and influential shareholders. They used the Gaza cash to spend again, and even went rather crazy, to be honest. John Hendry arrived, 500,000. Dave Besant, the goalkeeper, and Andy Thorne, centre-half, came from Wimbledon, both for record £850,000 fees. But the new look side didn't click at all, and unfortunately, McFall's plans all fell apart. United were in relegation trouble, and the popular McFall was sacked in October. And in arrived the bald eagle, Jim Smith. And like Bill McGarry's appointment before, a huge transfer merry-go-round occurred after that. Smith couldn't stop the drop. What could have been with Waddle, Beardsley and Gascoigne was the big question, of course. But looking back now, while there was a lot of supporter resentment to the three of them, to be honest, looking back with a bit of time, well, a lot of time now, nobody could blame any of them for going to the clubs that they went to. Newcastle just were in a bit of a mess. Boardroom was not rich enough or powerful enough to support the football club. They had very little cash, and they had to also spend an awful lot of money on ground improvements, and only started that in at that time and couldn't afford to continue. So something had to give in the boardroom, to be honest, and that was the start of another huge story that ran for a few years.
Yeah, Mark, another avoidable tragic relegation then, and as Paul says, instead of Gaza, Waddler and Beardsley, Newcastle were left with Hendry, Thorne in Division 2.
Yeah, when you put it into context like that, it's quite disturbing to recollect their memories. That was my first full season, 88-89, where I was hooked. Every game, if I could go, I would go. And it was quite sad again because, as Paul said, we lost Willie McFall. There was a couple of months it took to get Jim Smith as the new manager. And as Paul said there, we seemed to be selling and buying players every other week. There was no transfer window then. I think it ran out in March or something like that. But every other week, a new player was leaving or a new one was coming in. And relegation, we had a bit of a spell during, I think, February and March where we might have pulled out of it. As Paul said there in the 86-87 season when Paul Goddard's goals kept us up. This time we didn't really have that striker to do that though. But relegation happened. As I said before, we had a lovely new stand, but we had second division football, and the likes of Besant, John Hendry, and John Robertson, who Paul touched on before, that had all gone by the time we were relegated. My record signings were all departing. Jim Smith just loved the wheel and deal, but we had second division football and would go into that without Michael O'Neill as well. He lost his way in that relegation season. So it was testing times, but even though there would be a planned boycott, the fans pretty much stuck with them when we got relegated.
How did Newcastle go about tackling the challenge of bouncing back up then, Paul?
Well, we're back in the second tier, and more wheeling and dealing followed as the squad was completely changed. Jim Smith, as Mark says, loved the transfer market. Out went Mirandina. Jim Smith had no time for him. And in came the likes of Scotland skipper Roy Aitken, decent player. England regular Kenny Sansom at the end of his career. And two new strikers, Mark McGee and Mick Quinn. who sensationally scored 4 goals on his debut against Leeds. It was an experienced lineup and should have been good enough to get promoted the first time of asking. McGee hit 25 goals that season, and Quinn hit a marvellous 36. The pair of them were just top class. They reached the playoffs, but of course they met Sunderland of all teams. Newcastle were favourites for the final decider, especially after a 0-0 draw at the Old Roker Park. But infamously, they lost 2-0 at Gallagher, and the season ended on a very low.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't get much worse than losing to Sunderland in the playoffs. I think we should just brush past that, to be honest, and pretend it didn't happen. Luckily, prospects began to brighten a little bit off the pitch, even if they didn't look great on it. Hey, Paul?
Yeah, well, as the 90s began, the power struggle for control and ultimate ownership of Newcastle really came to a head. The Magpie Group was formed, led by entrepreneur John Hall. He at that time wasn't knighted. They eventually forced a change, and that was a huge story in itself. And all that corporate controversy must have affected the players at that time, and manager Jim Smith. He admitted that later after he left. United couldn't get anywhere near promotion in 1991, eventually finishing in a disappointing 11th. New forward Gavin Peacock arrived, and he looked a class act during that season. But Smith departed before the end of the campaign, and another World Cup winner took charge. Amazingly, the second one in a short period of time, Ozzy Ardiles arrived, the famous Argentinian. But he had little cash to spend, indeed virtually nothing, and he introduced kids from the junior ranks. And I suppose that had a silver lining, because those kids became stars in the years to follow. People like, or players like Steve Howie, Lee Clark, Steve Watson, and Robbie Elliott.
Yeah. Mark, what are your memories from this period of, fans enduring what is being served on the pitch whilst hoping for things to change off it? Sounds very familiar, doesn't it?
It certainly does. I think now we're older and wiser to understand more about it. But back then, as a teenager, you didn't really get involved with the politics. You didn't really look at cash flow forecasts and balance sheets. All you wanted to do was go and watch your football side win a football game. And as Paul said there, it was an aging team. It was experienced, but it was aging. And by the time Ozzy come in, I think the likes of John Burridge, Roy Aitken, Mark McGee, even the decline was quite rapid. And it was no surprise that the kids were given a chance. A, because we had no money, and B, because Ozzy probably didn't fancy these players who had ultimately failed for 18 months. But it was welcome. That Lee Clark was a standout player. I think, if I'm not mistaken, he may have been linked removed to Liverpool a couple of years before that. And that, thankfully, we kept a hold of him, because what a player he turned out to be. But yeah, it was great. Robbie Elliott, Steve Watson. Steve Watson was probably the main one for me. And you've got to remember, I don't know if he's still the record for the youngest ever appearance, Paul. You may correct me on that, but he was 16.
Youngest, yeah.
Yeah, he was 16 when he made his debut, and he was a standout player. Fair play to Ozzy for giving them a chance. He probably had to, mind. But again, because we attracted someone of the caliber of Ozzy Ardiles to come and manage our football club, you weren't too upset. You did always think, right, we'll go again next season. And 1991-92, it turned out into a very interesting one. But we weren't fearful. We didn't worry, of our current situation, because we had the kids, we had Ozzy Ardiles. It's just, again, another memory from that period, though. There was a huge attendance boom following on from Italia 90. And everyone wanted to go and see football again. But unfortunately, at Newcastle, it declined. Some of our attendances that season were pretty poor. And I remember selecting to go and watch Whitley Bay in a cup game that season instead of going to see Newcastle. I'm not ashamed to say that, but that's how disinterested and boring the football become.
Yeah. This is the season where the club arguably hits the lowest point in its history to date. Not just in terms of the mood at the club, but literally in terms of the league position. As the club, they flirted with the third tier of English football, didn't they, Paul?
They did. Fortunes were looking grim, without doubt. Great Gates had dropped to an average of just over 17,000, which wasn't very good at all. and there was very limited cash to spend. The stadium needed much development as well. Something had to change, and it did. John Hall stepped in fully and took over completely. But before that massive moment in the club's history occurred, Ardelia's gave youth a chance that season, but results were not good. The Magpies actually faced the third tier rather than the first tier. And before the end of the season, John Hall took control and a new manager arrived. And that, of course, was the second coming of Kevin Keegan, initially appointed in a desperate bid to inspire a recovery and avoid relegation. And as John Hall said later, had we gone down into the third tier, the club would have probably ended up bankrupt.
Yeah, I mean, we covered the impact of Keegan as a player in our last episode, Mark. The impact of Keegan as a manager, it seemed immediate. John Hall made that very important phone call to Keegan when he approached him to take over the team, famously saying, the two people talking to each other right now can save Newcastle United. You've got the passion, I've got the money. He turned out to be right, didn't he?
He did. It's good to hear that quote again because it's been a while. But yeah, you've got to give John Hall credit in this. He knew what he needed to do. He knew how he was going to get the fans. You know, where attendances weren't too bad or as a whole, but there was just an immediate lift. I mean, as Paul said, they dropped as low as 17,000 and more or less double for Keegan's first game against Bristol City. I was going to away games at this point, and you had to be there. You had to go to the games because you wanted to be part of this Keegan, revolutionising of the football club. Even though, as Paul was saying, we were on the brink of absolute disaster with relegation and bankruptcy. So it was interesting. It was. He was toying with the youth. He had David Kelly, as Paul said, Gavin Peacock, a great forward line. But it was touch and go right up until the end of the season. It was touch and go.
Yeah. I mean, Paul, remind us how close we came to the old Division 3.
Well, it was touch and go. We were very close to dropping into the third tier of football for the very first time, and that was very much similar to the one season in the late 30s when we were saved on goal average. But we had a crucial victory over Portsmouth at St James's Park, thanks to David Kelly's fabulous half volley, and everybody there at that time will remember that game and that goal. Then there was a very tense end of season meeting with Leicester City at the old Filbert Street. Newcastle needed a result to stay up. The 1-2-1, and there was just huge scenes of joyous relief at the final whistle by both players, fans alike. And that was the turning point in Newcastle United's fortunes. John Hall and his new regime moved into top gear during the summer and transformed the club into what became, in a very short space of time, a European superpower. And at the same time, the entertainers were born. And a huge credit goes to John Hall. We'll probably talk about him in our next episode. But whatever John said he was going to do, he actually did, and that was a big difference. It was the start of something quite special.
Absolutely, yeah. He's navigated us away from a very, very scary time, but the club survived. Mark, I was wondering if you've got any final thoughts on this period, 1984 to 1992. Wasn't pretty, but it has made for a very dramatic chapter in the history of the club.
Well, put it this way, I'm in my 40s now and I'm still getting goosebumps. Listen to Paul, remind me of how close we were to disaster, but ultimately what the next chapter would become. To summarise for me, it was a coming of age period for me. Newcastle was my life. Every single penny I got, pocket money or paper round money, it went on to Newcastle programmes, the strips, the going to the games. That was it. You live Newcastle United as a teenager. But from a football perspective, I don't think we could. We've moaned a lot over the last few years about how bad it has been under Mike Ashley, but at least we didn't get on the verge of third division football under him, But still, you look back fondly because of how it ended up at the end of that season, as Paul said. The Leicester game down Filbert Street, I was down there, and there was basically riots between the supporters, but ultimately you walked away knowing that your club had survived, and as I've no doubt you'll come to on the next show, we just lifted off after that, didn't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Start of a good few entertaining shows coming up that we look forward to. But this one's been really interesting. I've really enjoyed it. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank you, Mark. And also, I want to show people watching on our YouTube channel or on chroniclelive.co.uk the background that we've had for this particular episode is an image you shared with me, Mark, which is Panini sticker album page from 88-89 season.
It is. Unfortunately, it's the worst one I've shared, to be honest. But yeah, there's some record signings, there's some misfits amongst there. And we haven't even touched on the likes of McCreary, Rodan, and Anderson, who are absolutely stalwarts for the club. But yeah, at least Willie McFall's laughing on that picture.
So yeah, it's a completed page from a Panini sticker album, which probably reached their peak in the 80s and 90s. Panini stickers. I don't know if this was your book, but it's been completed. There's 12 players on there, plus Willie McFall's sticker and the sticker of the team. And that must have been a really exciting summer that season with the way the cash was splashed. Unfortunately, none of the players bought seemed to do the business, but it must have been exciting, at least for a brief period.
It was, I mean, even little things like we've got the new badge, which we've still got today. That was launched that summer. We had the new strip, we had the new stand. And as Paul touched on before, was signed what we thought were really quality players in Bessenthorne, Hendry, and Robertson. But it's just unfortunately there was too many players coming in, and when you lose the likes of Gascoigne, Goddard, and McDonald's, unfortunately it's just backfired. I do think though that McFall was unfortunate to be sacked. I do think he should have been given a chance. Because that was the first time he really got the money to spend. But yeah. An interesting season. I think out the ones we've just mentioned, the most enjoyable one for me was probably the season before, 87-88, because, as Paul said, we finished 8th, and that was a good finish for us back then, because we were always a mid-table side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just one more image, because you are the specialist in imagery from the 1980 to 1994. This brilliant one you shared with me. Was this from 87, 88? This is Mirandinha and Brian Robson pre-kickoff on the halfway line at St James's Park with the mascots.
It is. Paul may remember this one. If you look there on the right-hand side, you can see the new stand just getting developed there. You can see the Milburn seats getting developed above the paddocks. That's Boxing Day 1987. And we beat them. Man United were a great side that day, but Paul Gascoigne again ran the show. Glenn Roeder, God bless his soul, he scored the winner. And yes, that just goes to show Newcastle in a nutshell, doesn't it? On days we could beat anyone. But unfortunately, they didn't come too often.
Yeah. Great image there of Mirandinha. I think there's a great anecdote there, which Alex Ferguson tells of Paul Gascoigne nutmegs Remy Moses and pats him on the head as he sprints off into the distance, and probably thought, I'm going to try and sign that player, but it never happened, unfortunately. But yeah, great images. I'll put a lot of links going in the show notes this week. I'll put a link to Mark's Facebook page. It's really great. It's a fantastic rabbit hole of nostalgia from 1980 to 1994. So do check that out. And thank you, Mark, for joining us today. It's been good to have you with us.
Absolute pleasure, gents. Thank you.
So that's another episode of Chronicled done. The club is about to be rescued again by Kevin Keegan. So strap in, listener. We've got a superb run of episodes coming your way that's going to cover the entertainers era. In the meantime, if you have any stories or images of Newcastle United historic memories, we're always keen to see those. So you can email us, theEIBWpodcast at Reach PLC, or you can tweet me at Ketchel on Twitter. Please subscribe to the Everything is Black and White podcast via whichever podcast platform you're listening to us on, and press the notification bell so you get the episodes as soon as they land on Wednesday mornings. And follow Chronicle Live's Newcastle United channels on social media. We're at Chronicle NUFC on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. Video versions of these episodes are available to watch on YouTube, so you just search for EIBW Podcast on YouTube. And finally, stay up to date with everything Black and White by subscribing to our Newcastle United daily newsletters at Chronicle Live. They're free, and I'll put a link to sign up to them in the show notes. If you click that and scroll down to Sport Newcastle United Updates, select that, you'll be signed up to receive all the best Newcastle content that we're putting on Chronicle Live every day for free. Thousands and thousands of Toon fans are doing that, so join them, see what all the fuss is about. Thanks so much for listening to Chronicled, the history of Newcastle United, with me, Matt Ketchel, Paul Joannou, and our special guest, Mark Corby.